Now imagine waking up one day, going to work, and you receive an email from Elon Musk, which happened to millions of federal employees, which is someone you didn't know was your boss. And then Musk, in this email, warned people, millions of Americans, that failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. So you're being threatened that you will resign if you're not creating a new level of bureaucracy for a new supervisor that you magically have. Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. I'm Amir Whitaker, your host today, and we bring you topics impacting Black and brown communities. Today's episode is going to focus on what's happening at the federal level in terms of civil rights, oversight, accountability, and protections. So the U.S. Department of Justice is one of the most important federal agencies, responsible for lots of oversight, and is essentially the Attorney General on behalf of the people. So if there is a police department, or if there is even a city government or a state government violating the rights of the people, doing something that has a discriminatory impact, doing something that impacts voting rights or other constitutional rights, then the U.S. Department of Justice traditionally steps in and does something. However, recently, 2 reversals at the Department of Justice have happened that really impact the rights of people, millions of citizens, and our protections. The first came with the ending of a national database that's known as the National Law Enforcement Accountability Database, or NLEAD. Now, this was a database that the people fought for going back years, but especially in 2020 after our brother George Floyd was taken from us. Now, it was finally passed in 2022. And since 2023 alone, there's actually been over 150 police complaints entered into the database, spanning over 90 federal agencies. NLEAD, this database, provided key communication between the law enforcement departments so that you could see if an officer, for example, had complaints filed against them in other agencies. You know, one example is the officer Derek Chauvin, who took the life of George Floyd, had over a dozen complaints filed against him across different law enforcement agencies. However, he could transfer to another law enforcement agency without them even knowing. Now, this database was created to allow for different agencies to at least see these complaints. And just like that, on January 24th, it was removed, which is another issue in itself, right? Because there's been this removal of a public serving system without any notice given to the public. This also triggers lots of retreats happening within the Department of Justice when it comes to police accountability. There's been memorandums saying that they're ending the use of force policies, the federal standards used there, ending the use of body camera regulations, ending anti-bias training, and other things within the Department of Justice. Now, many of these things haven't even existed for that long and came after millions of people took to the streets in 2020. And one of the first things happening in this Trump Department of Justice is the reversal of many of these things. Another significant change under Trump's Department of Justice comes to litigation and oversight of different lawsuits and cases. Now, we as American citizens have the right to file a complaint with the Department of Justice when we encountered abuse from different law enforcement departments or even different state agencies. The Trump administration has officially decided to halt several lawsuits and several investigations. For example, the Minneapolis Police Department, which the Department of Justice previously found a clear pattern of racial discrimination and was in process to address some of that. That's something that's halted. The Louisville Police Department, where the Breonna Taylor case was, the department was investigated for racial bias and found significant racial bias, and now the Department of Justice is retreating from that. But there are other cases involving voting rights, involving employment discrimination, involving hate crimes that are either being paused or reversed. And the department is signaling that they are no longer interested in looking at these civil rights violations. Instead of enforcing the civil rights of the people, the department has indicated that they're actually going to go after DEI policies or any institutions that are trying to include other people and other groups. Another significant change that has happened at the U.S. Department of Justice has been the appointment of Attorney General Pam Bondi. Now, Pam Bondi within her first week, actually signed over 14 executive orders that have been reversing the Biden administration's previous policies, but also attacking and eroding civil rights protections that have been around. She recently passed the defunding sanctuary jurisdictions policy that will mandate the cessation of federal funding to what's called sanctuary cities. So Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, or sanctuary jurisdictions, because some entire states like California and New York have decided that they're not cooperating with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with ICE agents, because of the abuses of civil rights and different things. Now, Attorney General Pam Bondi has signed an executive order mandating the cessation of federal funds to sanctuary jurisdictions and that limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. And there are, of course, issues with whether that authority is allowed. She's also signed policies to eliminate DEI initiatives and, quote, investigate, eliminate, and penalize what they're calling illegal DEI preferences in both the private sector and in educational institutions receiving funding. Attorney General Bondi has also reinstated the federal death penalty, which we talked about how the Trump executive order reversed Biden's pause on the death penalty on people in federal prisons on death row. But what Attorney General Bondi wants to do now is weaponize the death penalty again in prosecutions and use it to add additional people on death row and to use it to really force people to take plea deals instead of the possibility of death penalty or life without parole. So the U.S. Department of Justice is just one of the federal agencies that are rolling back protections, oversight, and accountability for civil rights. We found over a dozen agencies have actually passed similar policies that are limiting protections and the rights for the people. For example, HUD, which is also known as the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they're proposing terminating over 4,000 positions, which is over half of this federal agency. And these positions and the staff, they do critical work, affecting disaster recovery, rental subsidies, discrimination investigations, and support for first-time home buyers. I know lots of people who receive HUD program support in purchasing their first home, or if they live in, public housing, they use HUD to investigate discrimination or issues involving the conditions that they're living in. Now, half of that federal workforce is about to be erased, and this reduction will lead to delays and disruptions in essential services and protections of our rights. Another agency being targeted and transformed is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, this agency is being weakened or potentially abolished, and this is the agency that protects consumers and protects citizens from financial meltdowns, that happen when banks are given bailouts and other things happen. This agency was actually strengthened to prevent such from happening again, whether it's the stock market or other protections against consumers in the financial sector. Those protections are being removed now. The Environmental Protection Agency, which provides many key roles. The president eliminated the Environmental Justice Project within the agency and recession of several climate and environmental regulations that impact our clean air and fresh water. There's been a dissolution of climate-related offices, the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, and the undermining of other essential environmental protections. The Center for Disease Control is removing data related to LGBTQ plus and health and environmental justice. They're removing tracking tools for different diseases, and they're limiting public access to information, which again was something we had a right to. The people had a right to critical information. Another critical shift in a federal agency comes from the EEOC, which is known as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I literally just helped a friend file an EEOC complaint a few days ago because she experienced discrimination in her workforce, and tens of thousands of complaints filed every year. And now there's a recession of policies protecting LGBTQ plus employees. There's the removal of guidance for gender identity discrimination and the cessation of processing discrimination claims. So our right to challenge our workforce when we encounter harassment or discriminations are now being eroded. Another department, which we talked about earlier, is the Department of Education, which sometimes works with the Department of Justice to oversee what's called consent decrees with different school districts. These are agreements that have been in place for decades to require the school district to make steps towards desegregating schools. Some of these have been in place since the 70s or the 60s, and now the Department of Justice and the Department of Education are both reducing their oversight of this. Of course, we can't talk about federal agencies without the new kid in town, which is the Department of Government Efficiency, DOJ, which has somehow believed that it can overstep lots of authority and take over several agencies and issue different things. And there's actually was an issue with Elon Musk himself sending in a mass email to over 2.3 million federal employees demanding that they justify their employment by listing their weekly accomplishments. The email, quote unquote, instructed them to reply with at least 5 bullets on what they've accomplished last week and CC your manager. Now imagine waking up one day, going to work, and you receive an email from Elon Musk, which happened to millions of federal employees, which is someone you didn't know was your boss. And then Musk, in this email, warned people, millions of Americans, that failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. So you're being threatened that you will resign if you're not creating a new level of bureaucracy for a new supervisor that you magically have. Now, there were many issues with this, and many federal agencies themselves, the supervisors and the leadership within those federal agencies, told their employees to not respond to this email. Also, the Office of Personnel Management later clarified that what Elon Musk actually said in his email was voluntary. It wasn't, as he, quote, said, failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. Instead, it was voluntary. So that contradicted what Musk claimed. So if you're one of those employees, know that you do not have to respond. Then also there's an issue with Elon Musk and this DOJ department demanding jurisdiction over all of these federal agencies, including somewhat the Department of Justice and what they're directing. And it's causing significant confusion, but it's also creating resistance within the federal government itself. But it's also clearly possibly illegal because Elon Musk has not been approved by Congress, neither has the Department of Government Affairs. But again, not to forget that the Department of Justice, which is the attorney for the American people, is now stepping back from its responsibility to protect and stand up for American people and stand up for citizens. And instead, they'll be targeting jurisdictions that actually stand up for people. So it seems like we're in unprecedented times in terms of attacks on civil rights. Don't get me wrong, this country has always attacked its people, specifically Black and indigenous people whose labor was stolen, whose land was stolen to create this country. But different agencies and government areas that were created for our protection, that people literally died for, are now being eroded. You know, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which helped create a lot of these protections that the Department of Justice oversees, being eroded. You know, the Department of Housing and Urban Development being eroded. And it's also important to remember the first lawsuit against Trump in the 1970s actually stemmed and was related to his housing situation. He was sued from Black tenants who alleged housing discrimination and also poor conditions. So there is a need for oversight. There is a need for an agency in the federal government, or at least previous politicians and lawmakers have saw the need for there to be an environmental protection agency, a Department of Justice, the Department of Education, you know, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, different watchdogs, because sometimes the government does not protect the citizens, whether that's the federal government, whether that's the state or the city government. And I wouldn't be a civil rights lawyer if the government didn't abuse human rights, because that's what we do. That's who we challenge at times. So just know that everything that's happening now is an attempt to roll back all the progress that we've made, not just from 2020, but going back to the civil rights era, actually going back to the Reconstruction era and different things. And we'll have another episode where we talk about private prisons and different things, because the 13th Amendment that allows for the legalized discrimination and enslavement, essentially, of our incarcerated people is something else that this administration is putting up. I also find it ironic that a lot of these agencies are being gutted, abolished, or dismantled because of what's being called bureaucracy, overspending, and waste, when literally one of the executive orders that the Trump administration created creates another level of bureaucracy that now requires federal agencies to respond to and answer to the executive branch of government, which didn't exist before and might be a clear violation of the separation of powers that we know. And also, if bureaucracy was truly the issue, then why is Elon Musk now another supervisor of over millions of federal employees, right? Think about that. He just created another level of bureaucracy by telling them that they have to answer to him now. So it seems like it's not really about bureaucracy. It seems like we're dismantling the protections for the people, and it's important to remain vigilant and defend these rights that our ancestors had to fight and some had to die for. So we're not finished yet, but just know that on the Know Your Rights Camp podcast, we'll try to keep you updated with all the things that are happening, because there's a lot happening nowadays. That concludes this episode of the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to follow us on YouTube at Know Your Rights Camp or on social media at Your Rights Camp.